Previous to the 1980s, the only real-world orientated sports bikes available were made by Italian manufacturers. You see, the Italians knew that a great motorcycle wasn't just about having the most horsepower, and while the Japanese focused on producing high horsepower but heavyweight motorcycles, the Italians produced bikes with stiffer frames and larger diameter forks, which handled very well for the period. But back then, if you wanted a sports bike and you couldn't afford an Italian bike, you basically had to make one yourself by adding aftermarket fairings, etc. As most Japanese bikes of the era were just a typical standard naked motorcycle. It wasn't until the early 1980s when factories like Honda introduced bikes such as the 901cc Boldor F2 that fairings began to make a regular appearance. Its 16-valve double overhead camshaft air-cooled inline 4-cylinder engine produced 95 horsepower, and it covered the quarter mile in about 12 seconds flat, with a top speed of 135 miles per hour. Honda followed up with their groundbreaking and very radical for the time VF 750F or Interceptor, which was arguably the very first full-on sports bike to ever come out of Japan.
Was it?
This bike had a 16-valve double overhead camshaft liquid-cooled V4 engine, which sounded like nothing else of the era. The Interceptor sported racing bike fairings that shaped the future for many modern sports bikes. Its half fairing exposed its beautiful engine for all to see, and it also featured a chin spoiler and many other race-inspired features. The Interceptor offered a rectangular section frame, alloy swing arm, alloy wheels, single shock air adjustable rear suspension, anti-dive and air adjustable 39mm front forks with an integrated fork brace, flat adjustable clip-on handlebars, somewhat reset foot pegs, triple disc brakes with twin piston calipers, a hydraulic clutch and a 16-inch front wheel to enhance quicker handling. As I said, back then it was indeed groundbreaking, and for its time an exceptional handling motorcycle. Its engine produced 86 horsepower, and it would cover the quarter mile in 12.5 seconds, with a top speed of over 130 miles per hour, which back in 1983 was pretty impressive for a 750. The early Interceptors did however have one major engine issue, that being excessive camshaft wear, which did damage the bike's reputation to some degree. Then, in 1984, Kawasaki introduced a bike which took them 6 years to develop. It was a 908cc liquid-cooled double overhead camshaft inline 4-cylinder, which produced a huge 115 horsepower, propelling the bike from a standing start over the quarter mile in under 11 seconds. It was the very first Ninja, the GPZ 900, and with its wind tunnel developed full fairing, the bike was the very first production motorcycle that would go over 150 miles per hour in standard trim. However, all of these bikes shared one thing in common, that being they were all still pretty heavy. This changed dramatically in 1985 when Suzuki released one of the most famous Japanese sport bikes of all time, their GSXR 750. It was a 749cc oil and air-cooled inline 4-cylinder motorcycle which produced 106 horsepower, way more than any previous 750s, and 20 more horsepower than the Honda 750 Interceptor, which was released just 2 years prior. It featured a box section aluminium frame of unprecedented lightweight. The whole bike weighed less than 180 kilos. Compared to all other motorcycles at that time, the Suzuki 750 was light years ahead, and it had the best power to weight ratio of any 4-stroke motorcycle in the world at that time. This gave the race-bred GSXR 750 overwhelming performance. The very first World Superbike Racing Championship was held in 1988, and to meet qualification regulations, prior to this, Honda began developing their RC30, or VFR 750R. They created this bike for no other reason than to win this inaugural championship. They succeeded, winning the title for the first 2 years running. All the bikes were assembled by hand, one at a time, alongside Honda's GP bikes. Its 748cc, 16-valve gear-driven double overhead camshaft V4 engine produced 118 horsepower in unrestricted form. It weighed a mere 180 kilos, just a tad more than Suzuki's GSX-R 750. And while its best quarter mile time was the same as the GSX-R, this was probably due to its unusually tall first gear. But it was at least 10 miles per hour faster, with a top speed of over 155 miles per hour. The bike featured quite a lot of new technology, including alloy pistons, titanium conrods, a single-sided swing arm and 43mm front forks with quick release mountings for the wheel. And today, they are one of the most collectible and valuable Japanese motorcycles in the world. Not to be outdone, in the late 1980s, Italian company Ducati started manufacturing their first liquid-cooled motorcycles, the legendary 851 and 888 superbikes. The Big L Twins' lazy, low-frequency but booming engine sound proved to be very deceptive. Even at redline, they didn't sound like they were screaming their heads off like the Japanese four-cylinder bikes. But with their Desmo Quattro valve trains and electronic fuel injection, they proved to be exceptionally fast, and Ducati won the World Superbike title for the next 3 years, proving yet again that a great motorcycle isn't just about outright horsepower. And they were so dominant during this period that for seasons 1992 and 1993, they absolutely blitzed the opposition on the World Superbike racing circuit by winning 39 of the 52 races held. Around the same time, Kawasaki released their ZX-R 750. While it initially weighed more and produced less horsepower than Honda's RC30, by 1993 it was producing over 120 horsepower. And it was mass-produced, meaning it was much more affordable than other comparable motorcycles at that time. It was, and still is, a very beautiful machine. It looked exactly like a race bike, with its large section aluminium frame and large air hoses that disappeared into the petrol tank to feed the airbox. Another small but very useful feature on this bike was Kawasaki's positive neutral finder, which made finding neutral an absolute breeze. All you had to do was drop it all the way into first and then lift the lever all the way up and presto, there it is. Neutral every single time. The ZX-R 750 won the World Superbike title in 1993, beating the much larger capacity 888cc Ducati. Not bad for a mass-produced 750cc motorcycle. The following year, Ducati released what many people consider to be one of the most strikingly beautiful motorcycles ever designed in history, the Ducati 916. While its engine was basically a stroked 888, the rest of the motorcycle was totally new. It produced 114 horsepower at the crank, 105 of which was available at the rear wheel, which was 1 more horsepower than the 888 produced at the crank. It featured a single-sided swing arm, upside-down forks, under-the-seat exhaust and much improved aerodynamics. The bike also had Ducati's very rigid steel trellis frame and very high-quality suspension. Combined, this meant its handling was impeccable, as was its braking and performance, and it went on to win the World Superbike title 4 times. While there were more powerful motorcycles available, Ducati offered more than just engine performance. The 916 had balance between both the engine and the chassis performance that set new standards. And even to this day, it is arguably the greatest motorcycle that Ducati ever manufactured. Its best quarter mile time of 10.6 seconds was as quick as any other motorcycle at that time. Around the same time, in the early 1990s, another truly legendary motorcycle made its first appearance. This bike was Honda's CBR 900RR, more commonly known as the Fireblade. What a great name that is. It was an 893cc inline liquid-cooled four-cylinder, which initially produced 122 horsepower. Of course, there are other bikes which had more power, but the Fireblade was revolutionary because of its light weight of just 185 kilos, giving the bike an extremely good power-to-weight ratio. This, combined with its beefy 45mm front forks, gave the bike a brilliant blend of the agility and handling of a 600 and the engine performance of a 1000. It was so good, in fact, that many would argue that it was the best sports bike of the era, and even after 30 years, the bike still doesn't feel dated to ride. If you're looking to purchase one, and you're a half-decent rider, you won't have too much of a problem keeping up with the current model sports bikes. A nice little feature that they had, which is pretty cool, was a small storage space under the pillion seat. Later generations increased in engine capacity and horsepower, but unlike many competitors' models, the Fireblade's weight went down, not up. They are an excellent buy on the second-hand market, and well looked after bikes will last for many years before requiring any engine work. If you find a good one, you just can't go wrong with any generation of the Fireblade. Of course, Yamaha were also making some great sports bikes too. Their FZR1000 had major engine and chassis upgrades for 1989, and the Yamaha FZR1000 X-Up was born. X-Up stands for Exhaust Ultimate Power Valve, which is an electronically controlled valve in the exhaust system. It boosted torque at low revs. It also reduced noise levels. It worked brilliantly and was used in many later model Yamahas, as well as being copied by almost every other motorcycle manufacturer since. The bike featured Yamaha's unique Delta Box alloy frame, which not only reduced weight, it offered improved rigidity. The FZR's engine was a 1002cc inline four-cylinder with 5 valves per cylinder. It pumped out a massive 145 horsepower, propelling the bike over the quarter mile with a blistering best time of 10.2 seconds, and its absolute top speed was approximately 165 miles per hour. However, compared to other sports bikes, the FZR 1000 was still a tad heavier. By the late 1990s, the Suzuki GSX-R 750 was more than a decade old, and it had gone through many changes in that time. Then in 1998, it was updated with electronic fuel injection, and combined with many other improvements including liquid cooling, this gave the bike 135 horsepower, while its dry weight was only 3 kilos heavier than the very first model in 1985. This bike was an absolute gem in every regard. While this new fuel-injected model was reasonably happy to cruise in city traffic, screaming at over 10,000 RPM was the bike's forte. Hence, if you're after a comfortable, relaxed ride, the GSX-R is just not for you. But if you are after an outright performance machine, then this high-revving Suzuki 750cc power plant was again the top dog at that time, at least in the 3/4 litre class. The same year, Suzuki released another street-legal bike which was originally developed for the racetrack, the TL1000R. It had a 996cc liquid-cooled double overhead camshaft V-twin engine, which put out 135 horsepower, far more than the Ducatis of the era. But the bike handled with far less precision than the Ducatis, to the point where at high speeds the bike becomes somewhat unstable, even dangerous. And due to this, the bike never really caught on and production ceased after just 5 years. However, owners of these bikes do rate them very highly, and the engine itself proved to be very reliable and powerful. Also in 1998, Yamaha released the single most impressive sports bike of the last 2 decades. This bike was of course the very first
Yamaha YZF-R1. It's a race apart.
Its 20-valve 4-cylinder engine produced 150 horsepower, and dry weight was a paltry 177 kilos, giving the R1 an incredible power to weight ratio, far superior to any other road bike at that time. In 1998, it was in fact the smallest, lightest and most powerful sports bike available. Although this very first R1 had many brand new features, it was its gearbox that was a major innovation. It was placed above the crank. This made the engine more compact, meaning the R1 could have a longer swing arm, while the bike still retained a very short wheelbase for quicker handling. It was meant to reduce the possibility of wheelies, although, having ridden an R1, I'm not sure it had that much effect on reducing front wheel lift. To put the R1 into context, it was the size of a 600, but produced more power at the rear wheel than the Fireblade did at the crank. It had near on as much horsepower as a GSX-R 1100, but it was 50 kilos lighter. It may not have been as fast as the hyper sports bikes of the time in a straight line, but it would certainly make mincemeat of them on any windy roads. Today's sports bikes have near double the power of some of these bikes, yet getting this power onto the tarmac can prove quite challenging. No doubt you've noticed that some of the bikes mentioned in this video are just as fast as a modern bike over the quarter mile, and they are well over 20 years old. I hope you enjoyed this trip down memory lane. Thanks for watching. Cheers.